Hello, I'm Abby Maiden, and presenting with me is Sarah Shuttleworth. I'm the National Plant Monitoring Scheme Volunteer Manager for Northern Ireland, and Sarah is the equivalent for Great Britain. The National Plant Monitoring Scheme, which will be abbreviated to Mpms throughout this presentation, is a partnership project between PlantLife, UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland, the Joint Nature Conservation Committee, and more recently, the Department of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs in Northern Ireland. Today, we plan to give a brief overview of the scheme now in its 7th year and how the first 5 years of data has led to a way we can nationally monitor plants and their communities over time. Throughout the presentation, we'll monitor the questions and answers, as Sarah has previously said, so feel free to put them in the chat function. The Mpms is a UK-wide citizen science habitat-based plant monitoring scheme that covers the major freshwater and terrestrial semi-natural habitats. The Mpms provides an indication of change in plant diversity and abundance across the UK's habitats through time, and it was really designed to meet the need for a standardised approach to plant monitoring scheme, which is identified as high priority within the Terrestrial Biodiversity Surveillance Strategy published by JNCC in 2008. Therefore, in 2015, the Mpms was launched, following a comprehensive trial and development phase, which involved botanical experts and volunteers like yourselves. The basis of this Mpms is that across the UK, monads, or simply 1 kilometre squares, have been randomly designated, and volunteers across the UK can allocate themselves one or more to survey biannually. The scheme's methodology will be discussed in more depth later on by Sarah. Next slide, please. So now I'll tell you a little bit more about the partners for the Mpms. So PlantLife, as I'm sure many of you are aware, is a wild plant conservation charity. From the open spaces of nature reserves to the corridors of government, they work nationally and internationally to raise the profile, celebrate the beauty, and to protect the future of wild plants. JNCC, the Joint Nature Conservation Committee, is the public body that advises the UK's government and devolved administrations on UK-wide and international nature conservation. They provide a shared scientific nature conservation service for the UK and are a mechanism for pooling resources to obtain evidence and advice on nature conservation and natural capital. The UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, or UKCEH, is an independent, not-for-profit research institute. They carry out environmental science across land, sea and air. And the Botanical Society for Britain and Ireland, BSBI, is a botanical society for anyone interested in the flora of Britain and Ireland and have been around since roughly 1836. And lastly, DERA, the Department of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs in Northern Ireland, which is a government body, and they have the sustainability at the heart of a living, working, active landscape valued by everybody. Next slide. So previously in the UK, there's not been a standardised long-term monitoring scheme for plants. There has been for many other taxa, such as birds, by the British Trust of Ornithology, such as the Breeding Bird Survey, or for butterflies, for instance, the British Butterfly Monitoring Scheme. But with major changes in the UK's biodiversity across habitats being reported due to stresses such as habitat change, nutrient enrichment, climate change, and the introduction of invasive non-native species, it became crucial to have a better understanding of plant populations. Therefore, the Mpms was launched. The Mpms provides a long-term systematic approach to plant recording, which reduces the risk of trends in plant populations being overlooked or masked by noise in the data, which can occur during ad hoc recording due to different methodologies being used by individuals or different surveying efforts. Next slide, please. So the Mpms has developed well over the last 8 years. In 2012, the partners previously mentioned came together to devise the scheme's methodology. Then in 2013 to 2014, a trial and development phase followed, including a pilot in 2014. After the successful pilot, the Mpms was officially launched in 2015. Thanks to the inclusion of the trial phase, this program is really being co-developed between expert partners along with volunteers on the ground wishing to take part from all backgrounds and levels of experience. This was important as it ensured the scheme is accessible and inclusive while maintaining a robust and standardized methodology which provided high standards of data. In 2020, during the spring launch, the scheme celebrated 5 years of data collection with the publication of The Health of Our Habitats And in October 2020, the scheme contributed to a new experimental biodiversity indicator, which Sarah will explain later on. This year, in 2021, is the 7th year the scheme has run, and we're excited to see what data we can collect later in the year. Next slide. So the scheme was established as there was no systematic survey recording plant species long term. The NPMS needed to include semi-natural habitats beyond protected areas. The NPMS is important to monitor the effects of different management practices as well as looking at natural trends. In the future, once more data is collected over time, the dataset can provide habitat inventories as well as being used to develop remote sensing technologies for habitats. Furthermore, the scheme's long-term dataset will allow the investigation of impacts of drivers of change. So this could include things such as introduction of invasive non-native species, the impact of climate change, eutrophication, pollution, the impact of pests and pathogens, animal-plant interactions, as well as the success of protected areas. In short, the NPMS aims to establish national trends, monitor the impact of management, support and enable improved reporting against stakeholder objectives and work plans, and to really add value to augment other data sets. Next slide. Here is the NPMS in facts. So the scheme records 408 indicator species within 11 broad-scale habitats, such as coastal. The scheme consists of 5 partners: PlantLife, UKCEH, JNCC, BSBI, and DERA. 5 plots are asked to be recorded by volunteers in each monad. However, the average number of plots recorded per monad is actually 4. This is due to limitations of volunteer time as well as limitations in access to suitable NPMS habitats within the volunteers' allocated monads. So please don't be panicking if you are doing this scheme and you can't find 5 plots. The scheme has 3 recording levels: wildflower, indicator, and inventory, which can be thought of as beginner, intermediate, and expert level. In 2021, we can look forward to 20 online training events, so watch this space in coming months for more information on this. Volunteers are also asked to survey their plots twice a year, once in late spring, early summer, and again in late summer. And finally, the scheme has 28 fine-scale habitats, such as broad-scale habitat of coastal, can be broken down into coastal salt marsh, coastal sand dunes, coastal vegetation shingle, and macaya. Next slide, please. So this infographic was designed as part of celebrating 5 years of the NPMS. Therefore, excitedly, some numbers are out of date. For example, we now have more than 1,450 volunteers. This slide really highlights the dedication of our volunteers, so we really want to thank you for that, as in 5 years, they've returned 876 monads, so 1 kilometre squares, with data and have surveyed 3,977 individual plots, which is incredible. And again, I'd like to highlight that's even more since this infographic was designed last March. So thank you guys for your efforts. Next slide, please. So to recap, the National Plant Monitoring Scheme aims to provide reliable measures of change for individual species and species groups within semi-natural habitats, using both positive and negative indicator species for each habitat. The species included in the scheme were chosen as they're reliable indicators, they're widespread, and are relatively easy to ID. And because the scheme is a citizen science project, it needs to be simple, repeatable, and achievable by volunteers. The basis of the NPMS is once a volunteer has allocated themselves a monad, they then establish 5 plots, ideally 3 square and 2 linear in different NPMS habitats. The volunteers then record the abundance of indicator species, so both the positive and the negative, during their 2 sites visits, one in late spring, early summer, and the second in late summer. So I'll pass you over to Sarah now, who will now go into more detail on the Mpms methodology. So thank you.
Thank you, Abby, that was great. Okay, so once a volunteer has requested and been allocated their square, their monad or their 1 kilometre square, they receive a welcome pack with survey guidance notes, a species ID guide, species and habitat lists, survey forms, and a map of their 1 kilometre square. So the ID guidebook was specifically created for the scheme, and it's compact and concise, organised into flower colour. However, volunteers can and do supplement with their own ID books of choice, as we all have favourite ones that we like to use. The guidance notes explains the details of the methodology, The species lists show which species are recorded for each habitat, dependent on surveyor level. You can also see the recording forms there tucked behind, which once used in the field are used for uploading the data onto the website. However, we also have a rather nifty app that can be used directly in the field to record the data. You just have to set up your plots on the website first before you can use the app for recording the field data. So once a square has been allocated, surveyors need to contact landowners to get permissions and access their sites. Again, help can be given with this, including a downloadable letter that we have off the website to send out to landowners. We also recommend a reconnaissance visit to identify MPMS habitats and establish your plot locations and record where they are so that they can be relocated on the first survey. Some squares that have been taken up by a volunteer previously can already have plots created, so somebody's already done all that hard work for you. So we always recommend a volunteer checks the square details on the website first. Survey dates then just need to be agreed with the landowner as required. So as we've mentioned and Abby's mentioned about the 3 surveyor levels, so each volunteer prior to recording the species in the field needs to decide which level they wish to survey at. So all the forms and the app can be used for any of the levels. So wildflower is the relatively simpler level in that there is a reduced list of species per habitat. For example, dry deciduous woodland, which is a fine habitat, has 20 species that need to be identified. These include species like wild garlic, hazel, cleavers, ivy, holly, etc. Whereas at indicator level, there is an expanded list of species to record, for example, 30 in dry deciduous woodland, so an extra 10, with the additions of species such as wood sedge, wood millet, and wood speedwell, for example. Us botanists like to add wood onto the front of a lot of plants, just so you know where they came from. Inventory level, however, is recording all the species that are present within the plot, and that includes any species that are not in flower at the time. So one of the scheme's aims is actually to support and train volunteers with the view to them increasing their knowledge and confidence and enough to consider moving up the levels as they progress. So just to give you a brief overview again, so of how 5 survey plots are selected within the monads. So there's an example map here. So square maps provided to each volunteer look a bit like this, although they obviously vary depending on where they are in the country. As you can see there, you've got some different coloured shadings to illustrate the different MPMS habitats that are suggested might be present within the 1 kilometre square. So we aim for 3 squares, square plots, 5 by 5 metre usually, and 2 linear plots of 1 by 25 metres. So there are pre-selected plot locations, as you can see with the numbers, and it is recommended that if possible, volunteers use these to avoid site selection bias. Because if you can imagine that if you got to choose where you wanted your plot to go, everyone would quite understandably choose their plot location maybe in a nice patch of grass and full of orchids. And as lovely as that is, if you imagine that that's scaled up nationally, then that could definitely skew the results, and quality data is essentially what we want. Whilst on site, volunteers use fixed landmarks to record the plot location and set up only temporary markers because we don't want to leave anything behind in the field. So in that picture there, you can see a lady's taken some rope and some pegs and things to mark out her plot. They then record GPS and make a plot sketch with a written description. And it's useful if they take an annual photograph from the same point or angle every year, because it can give quite a good indication of time, but also help with relocating your plot for the next year. As mentioned before, surveys should only be carried out in MPMS habitats, and ideally each plot should be located in a different habitat if possible. Linear plots can be along an arable field margin, for example, hedgerow or a watercourse. And woodland plots, as you can see, this one's got quite a lot of woodland. They are recommended to be larger at 10 by 10 metres. So all this plot setup is done on the website after you've gone and done your square reconnaissance. And then once you've done it that first year, it's already set up and ready for you just to come back twice a year, every year to survey. We do offer a lot of support and guidance on this stage with a YouTube video guiding people through it. And this year we'll be expanding that with a mini video series to aid people in the methodology and plot creation. So you can see exactly how it's done. So as Abby briefly mentioned, there are 11 broad habitats as they're listed here that covers basically all of the main broad habitats over the UK. Volunteers make an assessment as to which broad habitat they have for their plot, and they can simply stick at that level and simply record only for that broad habitat. However, the aim really is to also classify which fine scale habitat the plot is in. So each of the broad habitats are then split into these more specific fine habitats. So as an example, broadleaf woodland is split then into 3 fine scale habitat categories, which are dry deciduous woodland, wet woodland, and hedgerow of native species. So our training and online resources are a great way for volunteers to become confident at understanding how to classify habitats. We're currently enhancing this training programme with all habitats to be covered this year, as well as more mini-series videos, along with methodology and habitat classification can seem initially a little bit daunting, particularly for grasslands, for example. So during the rather unusual year that was last year, normal training and a large proportion actually of the surveys had to be cancelled. But the MPMS team worked really hard to adapt and provide an excellent online training programme. So whilst surveys paused temporarily in the spring and early summer, and even some in the later where regional restrictions were applied, the MPMS were keen to maintain engagement with the volunteers and ensure that we were still providing training and support. So for the first time, MPMS developed a weekly online training programme through the season on a variety of themes, from methodology to habitat-specific ID, and all the training materials are available on the website. So the materials released each week included learning aims and outcomes record, themed presentations, and then supporting materials. So all materials are then publicly available, but accompanying these themes, we also ran live training sessions on good old Zoom for MPMS volunteers. We also then held a number of data surgery sessions, which are like one-to-one book-in sessions to help with any queries about submitting data via the website or the app, and also held a series of regional volunteer virtual meetings so that volunteers booked in for their area could meet up virtually. In most cases, this gave the opportunity to speak with a regional mentor and the volunteer manager and meet other volunteers in the area in a COVID secure and less formal way to build the community feel. We feel we've also encouraged and seen more activity and greater numbers on our MPMS support closed Facebook group for volunteers, as it's become a great hub for surveyors to connect with each other, ask questions and provide each other with support. We've also developed and ran our first big online quiz for volunteers and plan to run another one this year, as well as being interactive and a fun activity for volunteers to engage in if we're not all sick to death of Zoom quizzes, that is. It complemented learning with the correct answers and rationale given rather than just a score at the end. It was also a very useful initial quality assurance tool for us really as well. So it helped us to understand how well volunteers at different levels and with different experience in different habitat types were doing with their ID of indicator species, and possibly to help identify anywhere that needed more training perhaps. I briefly mentioned there about mentors. So another level of the volunteering aspect is that you can volunteer to be a mentor. So if you feel that you can give support to other volunteers in the area, whether that be with species ID or with any aspects of the methodology, then they can be contacted as well. And we give extra support for anyone who wishes to be a mentor. So monitoring the MPMS habitat plots twice a year, every single year, provides an unparalleled opportunity to track and understand the response of plants to our changing environment. So it allows us to investigate the growing pressures on our environment from things such as eutrophication, climate change, and extreme weather, on how land management can affect biodiversity. And as I say, following the 5th season of surveys, so that was last year, we started to see stories actually coming out from the data. So if you've not seen our report, Understanding the Health of Our Habitats, which was released in March last year, just before the lockdown, I think, You can read the report in full and find out a bit more about the partners we're working with on the conservation and research page of the NPMS website, and also some emerging stories on our blog pages as well. So there's a QR code just there if anyone wants to do so. Otherwise, I believe Abby might have put the link in the chat. Yes, well done, thank you. So how are we doing so far? So as you can see on this map here of the UK, all the NPMS squares are either orange, which means they have been allocated to a volunteer, or blue, which means that they're still unallocated and waiting for a volunteer to take them up. So to date, we have 1,756 squares allocated to a volunteer. But that means that some volunteers do take on more than one square, which is very ambitious of them. And as you can see, some of the areas that are still yet to be taken up tend to fall within maybe the Highlands of Scotland, or areas of maybe high mountain regions, which just aren't as accessible for everyone. So we're working with a lot of the national parks, and we're also training up a lot of Mountain Training Association members. So maybe some of these areas can be taken up in the future. So last spring, as we said, we hit a milestone and celebrated the first 5 years of data collection from 2015 to 2019. So this comprises 5 years of quality data on plant communities nationwide, and data to develop a national indicator of habitat quality. It was 5 years of government-funded research and excellent partnership working, and 5 years of citizen scientists monitoring wild plants and their habitats. And importantly, we'd reached the stage where we had enough data to actually start looking at trends and indicators. So thanks to the huge volunteer effort during this time across all the survey levels, the NPMS database held 150,000 records of around 1,500 species, equating to 60% of the entire native flora of the UK recorded at that time. So some stories that were emerging from this data included impacts of a warming climate and extreme weather events. So there are indications of increases of bare ground and the abundance of species that are better at tolerating drought conditions. So the initial findings of the first 5 years indicate some wild orchids are moving north. Southern marsh orchid, for example, was once restricted to the southern half of the UK. Clues in the name there, isn't it really? But records have come in from much further north. Similarly, the spectacular bee orchid didn't occur in Scotland, but has been discovered at several sites around Glasgow and Edinburgh. Other plants are moving outside their usual range, such as early meadowgrass, formerly confined to the extreme southwest of England on the Lizard Peninsula. It's spreading northward. The opportunity to track and understand the response of plants to extreme weather events, such as droughts, like those that were experienced in the summer of 2018. So the NPMS data also showed a decrease in small, short-lived species during the 2018 drought. Vulnerable plants such as fairy flax, yellowwort, and soft brome took a hit from the extreme heat and the lack of water. The indications of increases of bare ground were recorded with a corresponding increase in those better at tolerating these conditions, such as salad burnet, which has a longer root, enabling it to reach down to the moist soil. Wild thyme with its tiny leaves was also able to manage water loss and beat the drought. But another aspect of things that are coming out from the data is looking at the increasing fertility of many of our UK habitats, particularly deciduous woodland. So these habitats are likely being impacted by a combination of fertilizer drift from fields and other sources of nitrogen in the environment, such as air pollution, unfortunately. So nitrogen-hungry stinging nettle, which we're all familiar with, is the most frequently recorded native species in our woodlands. In fact, just 5 species make up almost half the records in woodlands: nettle, bramble, cleavers, hogweed, and cow parsley. We've all seen woods full with these, I'm sure. So these vigorous species are often associated with nitrogen pollution and undermanagement of the habitat, and are changing the diversity of our woodlands. So once common native beauties such as early dog violet and marsh marigold are much less frequently recorded. Typically, these species are found in low fertility areas and are potentially losing out to nitrogen-loving nettles and brambles. much of our native flora, which often thrives in low fertility conditions, is labouring under unnatural levels of nitrogen, causing changes in our woodland flora, which is terribly sad. But another aspect we've also been able to look at is the impacts of non-native species. So the Mpms is the only citizen science project that allows us to see the most invasive species such as rhododendron, Himalayan balsam and Japanese rose and how they're interacting with native plant biodiversity across Britain and Ireland. So habitats invaded by the highest number of aliens were arable field margins, hedgerows and dry deciduous woodland. So this information can allow scientists to understand more about the impacts of non-native species upon native biodiversity and how these might change under a changing climate. Detailed records of plant communities are extremely valuable for understanding how plants interact with each other under our rapidly changing environment. So as Abby briefly mentioned, we have had the latest major achievement for us at the Mpms is the experimental indicator. So during the end of last year, DEFRA and JNCC published the UK Biodiversity Indicators. So these provide an annual view of how a variety of groups of wildlife and other indicators of action for biodiversity conservation have fared across the UK in recent years. So 2020 was a landmark year for Mpms volunteers because it marked the first ever contribution of Mpms data to National Biodiversity Indicator. Specifically, Mpms data from 4 of the scheme's best surveyed broad habitats have been used to create a new indicator for category C7 plants of the wider countryside. So the indicator is still classified as an experimental indicator and future work is going to be expected on this. However, getting to that point in only 6 years of field surveys just highlights the incredible dedication of Mpms volunteers in getting out into the countryside and establishing surveying habitat plots in order for us to understand changes to our environment, as well as highlighting which plant species are increasing or disappearing. The very diversity of plants in the scheme, from tiny annual field pansies to our precious towering ash trees, means that they can tell us detailed stories about how and why our countryside is changing. It's exciting to think that as data continues to pour in, we'll be able to tell those stories, whether it's monitoring the continuing spread of Himalayan balsam in our rivers and ditches, tackling rhododendron in Scotland's rainforests, or the ongoing decline of rare arable plants, or even reflowering of meadows thanks to restoration and improved management. So the Mpms data are increasingly used in ecological research and among landowners and decision makers. As these data accumulate, they will contribute to the government's understanding of how our countryside is faring, thus driving policy to help safeguard the future of our countryside. Therefore, heading in now into its 7th year, there is huge potential for future analysis to show change in plant communities over time. So as you can see, there is also a QR code there, many of you probably seen, and also Abby's put that in the link as well, I'm sure. So to find out any more about how to get involved with the National Plant Monitoring Scheme, please do visit the website at www.mpms.org.uk. And we're also on Facebook and Twitter, and also more recently on Instagram. And also any particular inquiries that you have, we do have an email address that you can write to us at support@mpms.org.uk. And visit our website if you think you'd like to become a volunteer. So now, Abby and we're going to have a look at some of the questions that have probably come in and see if we can have a go answering some of them. So just going to stop sharing for a minute. Right. Oof. So let's have a look where we've got to. I'll start. Do you want to start, Abby, if you've managed to have a look at some of the questions coming in first?
Yep, no problem. It's actually the last one that's just come in, but I thought I'd just start with that because it might actually impact a lot of people.
Yep.
So it's just saying this person hasn't received a starter pack, so thank you for making us aware of that. I've taken note of your name. There's obviously difficulties in the moment we have physical copies of starter packs, but with this working from home, they can't get into the office to necessarily post them out. So depending on when you sign up, getting them, there might be a delay in you signing up to getting a starter pack physically posted out. But what we have done is on the MPMS website, we've made digital versions of all the guidance notes, the ID books, recording forms. That's all. Everything you'd get in that starter pack is got a digital version that can be downloaded on the website. And don't feel like you have to print it off, because at some point when everyone can get back into the office, you'll get one posted. But I do understand that there can be the odd oversight. So what I'll do is take a note of your name and we can look that up for you.
Yeah, so basically since this third lockdown, our office has been closed in Salisbury. So every time anyone registers to be a new volunteer and requests a square and I approve it, everyone should receive a digital pack. So everything that they'll need with links as well. But every time I do that, I'm making a note. I've got a spreadsheet of everyone who I've got to send the physical packs to once I get back in the office. So there'll be a lot of posting on those days. So shall I go with the next question, which is, so do we observe and record at exactly the same time each year? So really, it's not as precise as that. We suggest to the volunteers that they get out in late spring, early summer once, and then again in late summer. Now, if people feel that they wanted to do that at exactly the same times each year, that's absolutely brilliant. But at the same time, that's not something we necessarily recommend. So it's just whenever that they can get out twice a year. That's the important thing, as we all lead very busy lives as well.
And don't worry if you're thinking like if you have a bit of inconsistency on the time of the surveys, it's going to impact the data analysis. It won't, because what we do is we don't actually take it when we're analysing it as plot 1, plot 2. It's just the dates that are used. So same again, say you plan to go out a second time, but as Sarah was saying, lives are busy and for unforeseen circumstances, don't panic. Just the next year when you go out again, just always make sure you put the dates on, because that's what's used to post to the plot 1, plot 2.
Yeah, exactly. Do you want to go with the next one?
Yeah, the next question is actually being asked in the chat as well. So a lot of you might be thinking this. It's asking, how do you know the records of plants moving north is actually because they're moving north, opposed to increased monitoring in these plants? And just checking the other question. Yep, it's asking, when analysing the data of plant migration, how do you take into account whether plant habitats have moved due to climate change or due to being introduced by wild planting schemes, for example? So they're very, very similar questions.
Yeah.
And in all honesty, that's a very tricky question. You have to take a lot into account. Using atlases such as the BI is very useful, because they record historically, like they're currently doing one now, the 2020 atlas, but the 2000 atlas is very useful in looking at this, because what it has in it, whether a plant is native in that area or not. So when we're looking at kind of if a plant's migrating, you can have a look at these other records to see if it's previously been recorded in that area. But again, the increased monitoring, because potentially that monad hasn't been monitored again, is a factor, and that is incorporated into the very complex data analysis, and that's done by the UK CEH, so the Centre of Ecology and Hydrology. So I don't know if Sarah wants to add anything to that.
No, I think you covered it there. That's great. I think Candy just wanted to know what was the name of the atlas again.
Oh, sorry, it's the BSBI Atlas, so it's the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland. And the one that's previously been published is the Atlas of 2000. And if you keep an eye on their website, they're currently working on the Atlas of 2020.
Yeah, they've been very busy doing that.
So
yeah.
But yeah, and you have to take into other things as well when you're looking at the plant migration, such as, like you were saying, wildflower planting. Is there any kind of if you can't see a natural progression, almost like a corridor, if there's no natural route for this plant species to spread naturally, and it's just quite a north spot and it's quite isolated, then you kind of have to look at it and say, okay, maybe this has been brought in by human aspects, maybe by car tires, or like you said, by wildflower planting, because I know wildflower seeds are very common, and they do often have a generic species that aren't really necessarily specific to any region of the United Kingdom, and sometimes include a lot of European plants as well. So you kind of just look at all of those aspects and kind of best judgment.
Yeah. I think I'll just move on to another question here. So Gillian McCready just said that she's noticed that there are fewer squares in the middle section of East Anglia. So why would that be? Is that because they're huge arable fields? So yeah, the way that MPMS squares are is a randomized way, but it's biased towards where MPMS habitats are. So if there are large areas that are just arable fields, as you say, then maybe there wouldn't be squares in those areas. So they're trying to be located where you're likely to get those habitats. Equally, that's why sometimes you get a higher concentration of squares up in some of the highland areas that may be more inaccessible, but at the same time are covered by lots and lots of the MPMS habitats. So it's randomized, but with a bias towards MPMS habitats. I'm just doing some quick ones here. So how do I find the app? So the MPMS app there's a link to it on the website, but if you simply go into your app store, whether that be for Apple or Android, and type in MPMS, it will come up. I've downloaded it already, but I haven't been able to start using it yet because it relies on you setting up your plot locations first before you can start recording in the field. But we're going to have a lot of extra videos on how to use the app later on in the season. So that was something that will help people out. Another quick one I just saw was about the fact that obviously we're in lockdown at the moment. So we're not recommending that any of the volunteers go out and do their square reconnaissances yet, because we're not advised, unless of course your square happens to be literally out your back door or very, very close by and it's simply part of your daily exercise, then obviously that would be different. But at the moment, we're not recommending that people get out there yet until restrictions allow. And with that sort of theme in mind regarding identifying landowners, as Daniel's asked here, so I'm actually working on a video at the moment about how to find landowners and sort of how to sort of navigate your plot when it comes through as a map. So I've actually taken up my own square, so I'm going through exactly this. And at the moment, the way that I'm using it really is like looking at OS Map and then at Google Maps, seeing where there's an obvious farmhouse. And most of the time these days, you can get addresses just from off Google for locations, or if there's a business, obviously. And then either you can download the letter off the website and send that off, or in my case, when I do my square reconnaissance, I'm probably going to take the copy of the letter with me and post it into the door with a copy of a map to sort of say this is the area that I'm looking at. So there are ways and means and we can obviously help on an individual basis if needed. Abby, do you want to take up any other questions that you can see?
Just saying, somebody's mentioned that they don't have a smartphone, so do they have to use the app? By no means don't. Even if you do have a smartphone and you just prefer pen and paper, we have the recording forms. These get sent out in your starter packs, and you can also download new forms via the internet and print them off. If you don't have access to a printer, you can contact us and we can send you some more hard copy forms out. So you can use those forms if you do prefer. We're not using the app to kind of get rid of those paper forms. It's just simply to make it more accessible for people who prefer to use an app rather than the pen and paper. So please,
I mean, we
don't
then
feel
do
any pressure to use it.
We then do obviously encourage that with those paper forms that you've done in the field, that you then obviously come away and enter them on the website that way, because we don't have enough staff or capacity to ideally be entering any actual data on behalf of people. So
definitely.
Yeah.
But also we'd recommend you just doing that kind of as soon as you come back for the field. So well, I don't know about any of you guys, but when you're writing notes in the field, sometimes they're not the neatest. So when you get back in, if it's fresh in your mind, it'll be easier to kind of enter that data rather than a couple of months' time looking and being like, what is that?
Yeah.
And then also it means you don't forget as well to do it later on.
Yeah.
Another question that's come in, it's quite an interesting one. It's asking, would we be interested in areas that are newly planted with indigenous trees? as there's a lot of tree planting going on here. That would be very interesting in terms of looking at the succession of that newly planted area. But in terms of the MPMS, I don't think it would come under a National Plant Monitoring Scheme habitat, because it would be newly planted. Sarah,
Although in theory, I mean, it depends what it was newly planted on. So a lot of the time, potentially some grasslands are obviously used for planting schemes. So it might be that it has been highlighted on one of our maps as an MPMS habitat, but perhaps a grassland one. So then it would be a case of
looking at that change in habitat.
Yeah. So that it could come up by that way, and it could be quite interesting. So I'm just going to briefly say that about how landowners, there's a few landowner questions here. So, I mean, I've been told that most landowners are very accommodating regarding allowing this survey because it's not allowing any additional access to their land, and it's just one person usually just coming twice a year. So most landowners are very accommodating in that sense.
And a lot of them do actually ask if you can provide them any of the data, and you're more than welcome to give them a copy of the species list that you found on their land. And it also just gets them more engaged as well. And it's good to see them taking an interest of what's growing on their land.
Yeah, definitely. If you keep scanning and I'll keep scanning. Do you have to be a certain age to do this? Unfortunately, we do have a minimum age of 18. I'm really sorry if there's anyone that's really keen and comes is under that age. It's just to do with our sort of insurance and volunteer policies with this scheme. But we're hoping that possibly at some point in the future that maybe universities and schools and colleges might take up squares, or youth groups such as beavers, cubs, all of that sort of thing, and then potentially incorporate that with as long as there's a leader that's the person that owns the square in that sense. So that's a possibility.
Somebody else has asked, how long does it take to do the 5 surveys? Now this isn't going to be a strict time frame. It's going to really depend on the habitats, the amount of walking between your plots, and also your own experience. So some people, they could do the 5 surveys in a day. Some people it might take 2 days. I wouldn't have thought it would take more than 2 days. And again, it will depend if it's your first time. If you need to set up plots, I would suggest giving a day just to go out, set up your 5 plots, and then come back and do the survey. Because it might be just a bit too time consuming to try and set up your plots. But remember, once you set up your plots, then the second visit that year, you just relocate them. And then again, going forward, you don't need to continuously set up more plots. You just go back to your sets.
I mean, most of the data that I've been inputting for people, that we do get occasional ones that are sent in to us that they've done all of their plots just within the same date. So it hasn't taken them more than one day to do all of their plots on their map. I've made a note, Helen Dignam, if you send us an email at support@mpms.org.uk, we can definitely arrange a one-to-one to discuss where to site your plots. We're more than happy to help with that. I understand that obviously if quite a lot of it is urban and stuff, so yeah, we can help.
Somebody's asked, does this cover Southern Ireland? Unfortunately, at the moment it doesn't. But obviously at the moment, due to COVID restrictions, this can't be the case. But if you do visit Northern Ireland frequently, or you live quite close to the border, there are plenty of plots along that border, and you're more than welcome to join in and survey when obviously COVID restrictions allow. So you don't let that be a limiting factor if that is the case, but I understand if you're very far away, that's just not possible.
Yeah.
So sorry about that. Another person was asking, how do you monitor the accuracy of the ID from volunteers? So that's really being done through the Q&A, the QA session that Sarah mentioned earlier. So there is plans for a big in-field QA, so quality assurance exercise, where we'll have volunteers doing the MPMS survey and an expert doing the MPMS survey, and really comparing the accuracy of the same sites being surveyed.
Yeah.
And as well as the quizzes are being used for that as well.
And the way that the methodology has been set up and the way that they do the statistical analysis afterwards takes into account volunteer level bias and things like that. So that is all accounted for as much as possible. What happens if a volunteer needs to stop recording their plots? Are they passed on to someone else and they need to cover exactly the same squares? So quite frequently we have volunteers who take up a square and maybe set up some plots, or even don't get round to that bit and then decide that their situation has changed so that they need to release that square. So they can either do that themselves on the website under their account, or we can do it for them. And then that square is then available for another volunteer to take up. If they had previously created plots and data, then the next volunteer to take up that square could use those plots that they've set up. They would already be there. But equally, if they wanted to set up new ones, that would be okay as well.
It's quite similar. Somebody was asking, are you okay to change plots, for example, if you change your county? And that's fine. Get in touch with us and we can organise changing your square location.
Yeah.
And then, as Sarah was saying, the information you've got in, like landowners, and any information that will help the next person, just ensure that's on your MPMS square information. And then hopefully in the future, someone will continue that square on your behalf, and then you can look at your new square.
Yeah, and equally talking of sort of square locations and things, so quite often people do sort of sign up and then realise there's not one that's nearby. So it might be, if there's no squares nearby at all, then it might be simply a case of waiting, and new squares do get released every so often. So checking up, but if maybe there are some squares nearby but they've already been allocated to a volunteer, sometimes we can go in and have a look and see whether that current volunteer is active and has been submitting data, or if not, perhaps we can either see if they want to release that square for somebody else. So they're all possibilities. And then there's somebody asking about I like how they've worded it. How many volunteers are already botanical boffins and how many complete novices? I'm not sure of the exact percentage split, but it certainly isn't all just botanical boffins. We have a lot of people recording at wildflower level and simply recording maybe only 4 species that are present within their site. Plus the training that we offer definitely helps people out. You can always take photos of plants and things like that. So you definitely don't have to be an expert, but an interest in identifying plants is really all you need to start with, and you can kind of move up from there. Just trying to see.
We've got another person talking, it's quite fitting, linking in with people's experience, asking about any ID apps we'd recommend. So I do believe it was the last MPMS newsletter that had an article discussing plant ID apps. So you'll be able to find that on the MPMS website, and it just kind of goes through any identification apps that will be useful and we can recommend, and where you can download them. So we've got no problem using an ID app if you'd prefer that than an ID book, or you could use a mixture. Yeah. Equally, the BSBI, the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland, they also have a very similar article looking at really reviewing the accuracy of these ID apps. So maybe if you were to read that, you'd be able to make your own decision on which app would be best for yourself. I think it grades it on the usability as well as the accuracy of the app.
Oh, just noticed somebody saying about found that the training programs have been full as soon as they've received the notification. So I understand that was last year. It was very busy, and we had limited numbers on our Zoom training. We're hopefully getting around that this year, Robert, by having all of our sort of habitat training like this style, so webinar style, with attendee potential up to 500 people. So we're hoping that that shouldn't be a problem this year. And yeah, I'm sure that you'll be able to book onto some, hopefully. And then
we're also planning this year to have them recorded.
Yeah.
So worst case scenario, if you can't get on them again, but as Sarah said, that's going to be less likely this year. They will be like, this is being recorded, you can watch them at a later date.
Yeah. And also here, just a question we quite regularly get asked is, can you choose basically the way you'd like to survey regarding putting a square in? Unfortunately, just because of the way that we have to create this robust methodology and to create the really brilliant data set that it produces, it can't be the ability to select squares can't be left down to an individual. It's all done as a randomized method. Just because if everyone got to choose where to put their squares, they would obviously find the most interesting areas to put them. However, one thing that we are working on is encouraging other projects and schemes and organisations to adopt the methodology and have squares created to monitor their sites. But that data then doesn't get fed into the core MPMS data set, but goes into another sort of plant portal, as it's going to be called, so they can still access that data, and it's using the methodology and the scheme's sort of ideas. So that's another way. Majority of the habitat in my square is improved grassland and intensively managed, which is not covered by the habitat categories. So funnily enough, my actual own square that came through has no MPMS habitats on it at all. So this was something that I was slightly faced with, but it's only that on the map it says that, but actually if I was to go on the ground, I believe that there are some MPMS habitats, they just haven't been seen. So I would say, obviously, there's the ability to go and do linear sites, so hedgerows, if there's arable field margins, that sort of thing. But just having a really good check, are there any little ponds and flushes? We always encourage, if you've got on your site, definitely try and go to record those. There's a specific bit in the guidance about those that can help you. So what happens if you decide to do the survey at the beginner level, but while you're actually doing the survey, you realise you can identify a few of the indicator species, but not all from the next level up? Do you record them anyway, and they will be recorded in the results? So Abby, I'm not sure what you would say about this, but you could always put those species in as extra species.
I was thinking the same thing. Rather than, it's good to see that you're improving, but rather than doing the next level up and then potentially missing other species that at the moment you can't identify, it would be best to do the lower level and then add them in as additional species. And then you'll probably find, like you're doing already, you're learning more and more. And then maybe next survey year, you can jump to that next level completely.
Yeah, that would be what we'd recommend.
Yeah. But to do the thing with levels, obviously the MPMS habitats, they're very different. You might find you're very knowledgeable in your coastal plants, but your peat plants, you're not as up to date in. That's perfectly all right. What you could do is you could be a wildflower level for your peatlands. And then when you do your coastal systems, you could be inventory, for example.
Yeah, that's a good bit of advice.
So,
yeah. Pamela just said she signed up to the website last year, but couldn't find a square near her. So since then has heard nothing. So essentially, with regards to finding a square that's near you, it is simply a case, isn't it, of just checking back every so often to see if there is one near you. In terms of getting email updates, you should be on the list for receiving all of our sort of round robins of newsletters, any updates like that. If you're not, Pamela, do send us an email at support@mpms.org.uk, and we can have a look into that. Trying to see. So somebody's just saying about ad hoc observations to augment the full MPMS survey. So essentially, I think I understand what they're meaning here, but if you were out doing your MPMS survey and you spotted, I don't know, on your way up, you spotted some rare plants on the side of the road or some, the road verge, then we would recommend probably using iRecord for that. If there are any additional species in your actual plot location, but that you're not recording an inventory or something, then again, add these as an additional species on your form. When it's to do with maybe other taxa, then that's not something that we're specifically dealing with. Seeing if there's is there a way that we can access a summary or simple form of the data findings for our own interest? So Obviously, there's the links to all of the full well, the indicator sort of information that with all of the data in that. Otherwise, all of the data gets regularly posted onto the NBM network, doesn't it? The NBN Gateway network. Yep. So that's a way that some of the data is available as well.
And people are asking, are purchase wildflower seeds a bad thing? And that was, I think, to do with our conversation about wildflower seeds could be spread on native plants. They're not necessarily a bad thing, but the advice would be to look at the ingredients of the wildflower seeds, see where they were sourced, and see if you could get a list of species, and then you can check if they're native species that are included in the list.
Okay. Is there a method for assessing which level you're eligible for? I would say that when you get when you register and you get all of your pack, there's the species list here, which has the list of ones that are attributed to each survey level. So just have a look through it for that habitat type and think, could I identify those species, or perhaps I need to go to the lower level, or perhaps, oh, I know all of those and those, so therefore I can survey at the other level. So it's really up to your own judgment, I would say, but at any point you can switch if you feel you're confident to move up, or if you feel like maybe you've taken on a bit too much, you can drop back down again. So would you agree with that, Abby?
Yep.
Yeah.
Got another person asking if we have any data on nitrogen levels. We currently, as the NPMS, don't have any data on nitrogen levels ourselves specifically. But in the future, we hope the NPMS data can be used in kind of correlation with other source of information like nitrogen levels, so we can then investigate things like eutrophication. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Have you seen any more that you think that we haven't covered?
There's a few right at the start about, is there any chance the renewed use of neonicotinoids could be stopped? Unfortunately, that's not really my area of expertise, so I wouldn't really like to comment on that. I don't know about yourself, Sarah.
No, I'm not sure.
Sorry.
How, I mean, any conservation organisation that has a campaigning side to it is the way to go with that one. And I know Plant Life are trying to be more at the forefront of campaigning. So, but that's not what we as the NPMS particularly deal with. But you can always go to our main website and just email our main inquiries email, and they'll point you in the right direction.
I think that advice would also cover the next question.
Yeah.
Which, can everybody see these questions, Sarah?
No, I think only the ones that are answered people can see. So we're the ones looking at them. Yeah.
So the next question was just really relating to people regarding rough ground as unimportant, and even cultivated lands as public property that they can trash. So spilling oil, fly tipping. Again, if you contact any kind of NGO, non-governmental organisations that's campaigning for these things, that would probably be the best course of action.
Yeah. So I think we've pretty much covered hopefully everyone there. Otherwise, we will be taking down all of these questions, and if we feel that there's anything that we can update with our website or information, anything, we will do, won't we? And you'll all be receiving emails from Plant Life regarding feedback for the webinar. So I hope everyone's had a really informative session. I know it's been very good for us, but otherwise we will bid you goodbye, and we will see you another time. Okay.
Thank you all for listening.
Yeah, thank you.